Tyrone Bowman live. The Real ID deadline is the 7th of May. And as it begins to approach, what you need to know. Stay tuned. Once again, Tyrone Bowman live. According to NPR, the headline reads, What you need to know as the May 7th deadline, or the May 7th Real ID deadline approaches. So, driver's licenses and IDs that are not Real ID compliant will no longer get you through the U.S. airport security once the law takes effect in a few weeks, but full enforcement may not start right away. So this article was written by Joe Hernandez. So let's get down to the essence of the article. The federal government says it will finally begin enforcing the national Real ID law starting on May 7th. For real this time, after nearly 2 decades of delays. For many people, this matters most for boarding domestic flights. Non-Real ID driver's licenses and identification cards won't get you through security at U.S. airports when the law is fully enforced. But are the millions of daily U.S. airline passengers, as well as their Transportation Security Administrations or the TSA, officials who screen them, ready for the changeover? In recent years, the federal government has set and delayed other deadlines for Real ID enforcement after realizing that not enough Americans would be ready with compliant documents, says Kyle Potter, executive editor of the travel website Thrifty Traveler. Quote, so they extended the deadline again and they will push it out another 2 or 3 years, but then there's no more urgency, he said. So this problem just keeps happening and happening and happening, end quote. As the latest Real ID deadline approaches in less than a month, here's what you need to know. So what's going to be happening on the 7th of May? On that date, federal agencies, including the TSA, say they will accept only state-issued driver's licenses and IDs that meet Real ID requirements, which include having applicants provide certain identifying information such as Social Security numbers. This doesn't mean that you need a Real ID to board a domestic flight. You can still use a passport or a passport card and an enhanced driver's license issued by some states, a permanent resident card, or one of many other forms of ID allowed by the TSA. And children under 18 don't need any identification to fly within the United States. But it does mean that state-issued driver's licenses that aren't Real ID compliant will no longer be accepted. According to TSA spokesperson Lisa Farbstein, 81% of current U.S. travelers already use a Real ID license or an approved alternative form of identification, such as a passport. So the question is, what will I get turned away at the airport if I don't have a Real ID? Good question. It's still unclear whether travelers carrying a non-Real ID license will be sent packing or just face additional scrutiny by law enforcement. If an FAQ on its website, the Department of Home, or in an FAQ on its website, the Department of Homeland Security says travelers without a Real ID compliant license or acceptable alternative beginning May 7, 2025 will not be permitted through the security checkpoint. So, ladies and gentlemen, just make sure we get all our business straightened out. But the TSA has said it plans to begin phase enforcement, quote unquote, on May 7th, though it hasn't shared details about what that means. In a federal rule published this year, the agency said it could take a phased, quote, approach to enforcement over 2 years, with the ability to issue warnings to people without Real IDs to avoid a serious risk of operational disruption, negative public impact, and potential security vulnerabilities. Now, you know, like I know, these TSA cops are going to think that they are the real cops. And all type of chaos and confusion is going to ensue. Guaranteed it's going to happen. Another TSA spokesperson told member station KUT that security officers may subject travelers with non-real ID licenses to extra screening measures. Potter, the travel editor, said he thinks the TSA and the federal government are trying to find a middle ground of telling people that real ID is happening, but giving them some wiggle room to avoid the kinds of mass disruptions that nobody wants in air travel. So, how do you get a real ID? First, check to see whether you've got a real ID already. Your driver's license or ID card is compliant with the new rules if it has one of these star markings in one of its top corners. Otherwise, you should check with the motor vehicle agency in your state to find out how to get a real ID. According to the Department of Homeland Security, you'll need to provide documentation showing your full legal name, date of birth, social security number, and lawful status, as well as two proofs of address. But federal officials say to double check with your state to find out exactly what documents are necessary and whether your state goes beyond the minimum federal real ID requirements. The fast approaching deadline has led to a surge of applications at state DMVs from Oregon to Pennsylvania as people rush to get compliant licenses. So, why is all this happening anyway? The Real ID Act was signed into law in 2005 after the 911 Commission warned that it was too easy to obtain a driver's license in the United States. But there have been hurdles in getting all 50 states and U.S. territories to adopt the new requirements and begin issuing real IDs, something the federal government estimated in 2007 would cost states $11 billion to implement. More recently, issues stemming from the COVID-19 pandemic have caused additional delays. It wasn't until 2020, 15 years after the Real ID Act became law, that all 50 states became compliant with its licensing requirements. In addition to airports, people entering certain other federal facilities and nuclear power plants will also be required to present a real ID, the Department of Homeland Security said. So there you have it. Real ID deadline is approaching. Never surrender. Never quit.